guidelines. And what we did again is we looked at the amount of animal source, the amount of leftover streams that were produced from the plant-based part of the diet, and then assessed whether or not we can produce the recommended amount of animal source food in those guidelines. What you can see is that we did this for different countries, which you can see here, and different scenarios. So the scenarios you can ignore for now, and here you can just see that there are different countries and different scenarios. Then you can see here the different products, so milk, beef, pork, chicken, eggs, and fish. If the dots are on this side of the line, it means that we cannot produce the recommended amount according to the guidelines. If they are on that side, this side of the line, we can produce the recommended amount. So what you see is that for milk, this is in most cases possible, or at least for quite some, but then we go to beef, becomes more difficult, pork become even more, and then chicken, they are all on this side of the line, for eggs also almost, and for fish all. So you can actually see that it's really hard to produce this diet, according to the food-based dietary guidelines, in a circular way. So then, of course, the question is, should we adjust this guideline? And that the guidelines are developed also based on different cultural aspects. So this is also something that potentially people are hopefully willing to consume. We, of course, see that today still people don't consume or don't have the diets according to the guidelines, but in those guidelines, cultural aspects are also accounted for. And of course, health recommendations are accounted for. But then if we also want to include more environmental principles and also take circularity into account, you see that this not always goes hand in hand. So although we saw differences, and although it might not be possible to produce like food-based the diets according to the food-based dietary guidelines in a complete circular way, our results showed so far that using animals as kind of recyclers in the system has environmental benefits. But we also saw that their role really depends on how we redesign the food system. And to get a better understanding of this, we started to develop the CFOS model, the Circular Food Systems model. And what this model does is it minimizes the environmental impact in terms of, for example, greenhouse gas emissions and land use, while at the same time making sure that we produce a healthy diet. And with a healthy diet, I mean, therefore, that we get all the nutrients, so protein, vitamin B12, calcium, and so on, but that we also consume the right food. So it also looks at what we actually eat. So we get enough fruits and vegetables and things like that. So now we published this model for Europe. And what we did for Europe is we divided Europe into different zones based on climate and soil conditions. And that actually allows us to know which crop we can potentially grow where. So if the model selects a certain crop, different products are produced. We get crop residues, but we also get certain byproducts, and we get human food. Then part of this food might be wasted, and we also produce human excreta. And all those different leftover streams can be used as a fertilizer, or as part of them can be used as a feed for animals. If we are producing animals, we get again animal source foods, but we also get byproducts such as slaughter waste and manure. Then we can also make use of sustainable fisheries, which provide human food, but they also provide again byproducts which can be recycled in the system again. So at the end, the model tells us what it's the most healthy, sustainable diet, let's say, but it also tells us then, if we want to have this diet, which crops should we grow where, which type of fertilizer to use, and which animals and how many animals should we keep. So it shows how the whole production system is changing when we are also changing our diet, or the other way around, of course. So everything in this model is linked, and then that makes also the model unique. So for example, if we change something in our diet, then also the amount or the composition of the food waste is changing, that might again affect the composition of the livestock feed again, which might affect the composition of the manure, which then affects again the composition of the fertilizers used on the field again. So all those things are in relation to each other. So what we did is we developed 4 different scenarios of a circular European system. And we selected those scenarios really because we wanted to show big differences. Not necessarily because we want to have very realistic scenarios, but we wanted to show the effect of certain assumptions or choices that we make in the food system. So our very first scenario here is the agri-based scenario, which is the European production system. So it doesn't reflect our consumption pattern. It really focuses on what do we currently produce in Europe. Because of course, for our consumption pattern, we also import products that we then consume. So it only focuses here on what we produce in Europe. Then in this scenario, we start to apply circularity principles, but we still consume today's diet. And we focus on the self-sufficient European food system. Then in this scenario, we again apply circularity principles, but we consume a healthy diet. And again, only focus on the self-sufficient European food system. Then here, in this last scenario, we actually aim to produce as much healthy diets as possible, which we can produce so only within Europe. So how many healthy diets can we actually produce? So we do also have an export function here. So in those 2 scenarios, we minimize agricultural land, so arable land plus grassland, we minimize. But in this one, we maximize the number of healthy diets that we can produce. So let's look at the results. If you compare, what we see here is that in this Sir Agri scenario and in the Sir Health scenario, we reduce agricultural land with 71% compared to today's situation. And this reduction mainly comes from grasslands, but I will tell you a bit more about that later. Well, in this scenario, we use more or less the same amount of land. Then if we look at greenhouse gas emissions, we see in the Sir Agri compared to today's production system, we see a reduction of 21%. Well, in the Sir Health scenario, this reduction is 29%. And then in this one, it's actually 38% per person per year. So those reductions, as you can see here, are expressed per person per year. If we look at the overall emissions, so the sum of all the emissions together, then the last scenario actually results in an increase of 55%. So in the last scenario, the emissions per person are reduced, but the overall emissions are increased with 55%. And this, of course, has a large impact on your local environmental conditions. But in this situation, we also produce an additional 760 million extra healthy diets. So you can see that we have a large export function in this last scenario. This, of course, has an impact on what we consume. So in the first case, in the Sir Agri scenario, we still consume it's still the same diet on a food group level. So we do see differences of certain types of products within certain food groups, but on a food group level, it's the same. So we consume around 83 grams of protein per person per day. And then if we go to the healthy scenario, this is reduced to 64 grams of protein per person per day. But it's not only a reduction in the total amount of proteins, we also see a shift between the ratio of animals and plants. So in the current system, we consume around 60% of our proteins we get from animals and 40% from plants. And in the Sir Health and the Sir Population Plus scenario, we see that we get around 40% of our proteins from animals and around 60% of our proteins from plants. So it's a reduction in overall proteins, but it's also a reduction it's also a shift from animals towards more plant-based proteins. I now expressed all the results in proteins because a lot of studies actually do this, but I will also direct you or show you our dashboard later. And there you can actually see the results for all of the different nutrients that we assessed. So this is just, I just show this so it's more comparable with other studies, but if you are interested in the other nutrients, they are also available. So of course, this change has a large impact on our different production systems. So let's first look at the animal production systems. What you can see is that in the first scenario that the animal numbers are largely the same compared to the agri-base, because of course the amount of animal source food is still the same on this food group level, but we do see a change in the type of animals which are selected. So in our current situation, we, for example, have more beef cattle than in the Sur Agri scenarios. In the Sur Agri scenario, red meat mainly comes from pork, while in the baseline, it also largely comes from beef cattle. Then if we go to the Sur Health scenario, we see that mainly dairy and fish and some laying hens are kept. And in the Sur Population Plus, we see this more extreme. We actually see an increase in dairy, and this has to do with the fact that we have this export function. So we are actually, per person, we don't see this, of course, this increase, but the overall, because we now produce also healthy diets for outside Europe, we see an increase in the number of cows and fish there, but you see a very, very large decrease in the other animal numbers. Then looking at the different crop production systems, what we see today is we have a lot of grains and oil crops. Then in the Sur Agri, we see actually that most of the grasslands are not in use anymore. And then if we go, but the rest of the crops is, not so different compared to the baseline situation, because we still, for example, feed our animals with fodder crops. And then here in this health situation, we actually see also a difference in the types of crops. And that has to do with the fact that we get less proteins from animals. So we need, for example, more legumes in our diets. And that has to do with this protein transition aspect. So we see more diverse cropping system in the last scenario. And the same applies for this Population Plus scenario, but in this case, all the grasslands are used. So I realized that the redesign that I just showed to you is rather radical, but it's also important to realize that it builds on all things that we can do today. So for example, use more sustainable energy sources, consume a healthy diet, try to avoid the waste and otherwise use it in the most efficient way. And try to also use all the organic waste that we produce, including human excreta, and more diversification of cropping systems. So a lot of the elements that I presented to you are things that we can implement today. But I would also like to stress that the scenarios that we developed, as I said earlier, are more extreme scenarios to also show you the potential of what happens if we apply circularity principles, or what happens actually if we start to consume a healthy diet, or what is the impact if we actually also have an export function as Europe, and so on. But what we want to do now is to make scenarios in co-creation. And therefore, we are also developing a serious game, which is based on the model. And this serious game helps us to actually develop different scenarios in co-creation with all different food system actors. And those different scenarios we can then model again, and this will provide hopefully a lot of insight for people to actually understand the impact of certain choices that we make as a society. So my conclusion is that consuming a more healthy diet will reducing the consumption of animal source food will reduce the environmental impact. So it's not needed to consume no animal source food, but we see still a large reduction in the amount of animal source food. But we also see in our results that animals still play an important role in providing certain nutrients, such as, for example, calcium and vitamin B12. That redesigning the food system towards more circular food systems offers the potential to produce food with respect for human and planetary health. And it's very important that we keep this food systems approach in mind. As I showed you, that all the different elements in the food system are related to each other. So if we change something on some point, it always has an effect somewhere else in the system. And understanding these relations and understanding the impact of the choices that we make is very important to secure that at the end, that the solutions that we pick indeed result in the reduced environmental impact that we accounted for. Thank you so much for your attention. This paper that I refer to is an open access publication on our website, which you can see here. We also have a dashboard available, which gives all those results in much more detail than I presented to you today. And also on our website, you can find most of our publications, as almost all of them are published in open access. So thank you so much for your attention. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really great. Yes, so we have, there is a question here. It says, don't you think that the scale at which we produce our food is itself an issue? And if we address that, is it going to, so going back to small scale, more people going into farming, we enforce circular food systems. I'm living in a rural area in Spain, and many neighbors can be called subsistence farmers, where waste does not exist.
Okay, I just need to focus a bit on the question.
Yeah.
So that's more the question relates to how the effect of the skill of the farmer and the effect of transportation, the effect of transportation in the system, if I understand the question correct. So I think that's like the issue of skill is something that we are assessing at the moment, because in some cases, if you think of certain products that we need in terms of essential nutrients, it makes sense to look at where can we produce those products most efficient in terms of the environment. So not efficient in terms of cost, but efficient in terms of the environment. So think about, it's very hard to produce certain crops here, while in other warmer climates, or here in the Netherlands, I mean, then while in other warmer climates, it's feasible to produce them. And if they provide essential nutrients for our diet, it sometimes makes sense to maybe transport certain products. So I think per product, we need to look at what is the most, on which scale should we close the loops. And I think that's not necessarily always, it's not necessarily that we always have everything local, although I think in general it would makes a lot of sense to have a lot of local production systems. Then related to the small scale, I also think that depends on where you are and in which systems we envision in the future. So for example, think about a lot of waste and food waste that is collected in big cities, for example. So there I can envision also a large-scale production, a pig production system, which is then converting all the food waste. Of course, we can also consider there are other aspects such as animal welfare issues. So this is again a different topic that we need to consider. But yes, I think in general, skill definitely plays a role, but I'm not saying necessarily no to big, large-scale farms. I think it really depends on how those large-scale farms are functioning. So yeah, it's more nuanced, I would say.
We have another question. It says it's 2-in-1. Considering the small scale of dairy farms in Turkey compared to countries like Germany and the Netherlands, what are the specific challenges and opportunities in implementing local circular economy principles? And then we can go to the next one. I don't know if you want me to go to the next one. So how might the transition period be challenging for Turkish dairy farms, and what strategies could be employed to overcome these challenges effectively?
Yeah, so I think circularity, and that's, I think, with all the innovations, are never, they're always local specific. So I think if you look, like in the Netherlands, we have specific, certainly specific problems. So, for example, if you think about the amount of waste that we produce, the amount of animals that we have, we face different issues than if you would think of a smallholder farmer with a few cows in the mountains. And that relates then again also to the number of animals that you actually have per hectare and what you feed them with. So I think some systems are already today much more circular compared to other systems. And I think that is something that we need to assess case by case. So I wouldn't say that the dairy farm in Turkey should apply the same circularity principles as in the Netherlands or as in Germany. I think they are very, very different. But of course, the principle of avoiding waste and then the second principle of utilizing the waste in the most efficient way applies for everyone. But the amount of waste which is produced is very different among different countries.
We have a third question. It says, I am working on alternative crops, Chenopodium, quinoa, genotype Puno, and Vikinga, which is high in plant-based protein and fiber. Would take less resources, less arable land, and would be having nutritional values as much as conventional food source, and using camel manure for the growth and maintaining NPK complex in the soil. What is your take on this?
Which crops?
It says Chenopodium, quinoa, genotype Puno, and Vikinga.
Okay. I don't know all of them, of course, but what we see, so what we did so far, and I think that's also important to stress, is that we looked at the European system and we looked at the main crops that are produced and consumed right now, which are around 55 crops. There are much more crops, of course, available. And there, of course, are much more production systems available. So we now look at the main animals, as you could see, like dairy, beef, pigs, and then layers and broilers and fish. But in our next steps, we are interested in actually assessing or including more diverse systems. So also more different types of crops, but also different types of animal production systems, but also different types of producing. So more based on the organic principles and all those kind of things. So this is something which is a next step in which we want to assess the potential of this. But we now also focused on this to actually see what can we do, because we have all those crops, we know how to produce them, we know their yields. So what if we actually make this change? What is already the gains that we can get by consuming differently and by changing the production systems, but not having complete new systems in that sense. So it's more changing from grains to more pulses, for example, instead of saying, okay, we have complete new, like, insects included in the model, for example, or in the food system again, because that raises again a whole new storyline and aspects we need to consider. So we really base it on everything, or all the components that we kind of have now in the system, on the today's production system. So also the yields are based, for example, still on the assumption that pesticides are used. So all those kind of things, and those are the next steps that we want to include now in the model to get a better understanding of this. So I don't know how those specific crops or how camels will actually will help us to make the system more sustainable. Those are very specific questions that we would need to assess again.
So Thomas Jones says, is asking, so animal-based production should be from grassland and food waste, that is crops not fed directly to animals.
Sorry, can you say it again?
It says, so animal-based production should be from grassland and food waste, that is crops not fed directly to animals. So I imagine he's thinking that food waste is what we provide to the animal production.
Yeah, so you mean, and then the second part is, and we shouldn't use the crops directly as feed for animals. Yeah, so what we see, and there it becomes a bit, so yes, it's partly the food waste, and yes, it's also partly the grasslands. Also a lot of byproducts. So byproducts I wouldn't really call waste. Um, uh, so it's different compared to food waste. So byproducts also play a big role, but it's not completely avoiding feed food competition as what I actually would have expected first, because what we see is that we have also crop rotations in our model. And in a crop rotation, you, for example, can only grow sunflowers once every 6 years. So what it does, the model, is it selects, of course, the nutrients that we need on our daily basis. So, for example, we already fulfilled all the nutrients and the food items, but we still miss a certain specific oil. So in that case, it needs to produce the sunflowers, but then the rest of the 5 years, that land is kind of, not really needed again. So in those 5 years, it, in that sense, often selects a fodder crop like alfalfa, which is then from an environmental perspective and very beneficial. So it also feeds the animals with those fodder crops. So that is a stream which is also really important still within the circular food systems that which we modeled, and it has to do really with those rotations, finding an optimal rotation which then also reduce the environmental impact. So that is one thing. But we also see that we simply, as also the study from the food-based dietary guidelines very clearly showed, is we don't have enough waste available to meet a lot of the nutritional requirements. So, for example, we found that vitamin B12 is always limiting, calcium is always limiting. So then we can start working with supplements and actually see how supplements will help us then to further reduce the environmental impact. But because, there is still a lot of, that's really a new research field to go into. So we didn't include supplements in the model so far. So there are two reasons why it's not only the food waste, the byproducts, and the grass which are used, but also the fodder crops.
Another question. The Q&A, it says, I assume that there is currently also a use for side streams from agricultural land. Does the model also take into account the consequences of using side streams? For example, if straw is used now for soil quality / nutrient recycling, if this is removed from the land, it might have an impact on the local farmland.
Yeah, so we didn't, the crop residues cannot be used as feed for animals. So they really stay on the field. We do, of course, they do account then, but that's a relatively small amount in terms of the nutrients which go back in the soil. But we don't, because of this reason, because of soil quality reasons, we didn't want to make that assumption that they will be taken off the fields.
Tim Reed is asking, how many and which of the current EU agri-production systems could be considered circular? Are they specific to certain geographical area or countries?
That I would really not know. I think what we do see, at least in the Netherlands or in the feed industry, is that a lot of the byproducts are already in use. So this is all the things that come from processing. I see also a trend towards in which a lot of the waste that is produced while processing. So, for example, if we make cookies and then there are production mistakes, those kind of, I think it's called former foodstuffs. Those are also much more recycled in the system as feed. Then of course we have food waste, which due to food safety issues aren't allowed to be used in the system. So this is a stream which is really unused. But where and which systems are circular, that's something which I cannot answer.
Okay, we have some questions from the chat. It says, thank you very much, very clear and interesting. You talked about greenhouse gas emissions, land use. Which other indicators you think are interesting to report when assessing circularity?
Yeah, so we now started with greenhouse gas emissions and land use. We are adding at the moment N and P use and biodiversity. Of course, on the wish list is also water use, but we are not that far yet. So that's still something which is on our wish list. And we are also adding that doesn't relate to the environmental aspect, but we are also adding economics to the model to get a better understanding of this, although it's very challenging to predict prices in the far future, but okay. And we are adding more detailed health components to get also a better, because we now have the foods more on like the first pre-processed step, but then what you do actually with the different foods, like do you make a pizza or do you make snacks, or like there are lots of different items that you can consider. This is a step that we didn't account for yet, so that's also something we are working on. And then adding like more other alternative farming practices, such as like what is the effect of no tillage or no pesticides and all those kind of things.
The other question here, it says, how about the productivity within the studies done in Europe, for example, within animal? If we alter diets of animals, does their productivity remains consistent?
Yeah, so what we did is we developed kind of, you can say different animal types or scenarios. So for example, we have a low productive animal, a mid productive, and a high productive animal. And then the low productive animal needs different requirements. So for example, different protein and energy requirements, and have a different feed intake capacity and things like that. And that productivity is always that requirement is always linked to the productivity. So if you have a pig of 100 kilos or 110 kilos, the requirements of the pig that weighs 110 kilos is different compared to the one that weighs 110 kilos. So there is this is how we account for it. And then the model actually makes a diet. So it formulates a diet that fulfills those requirements. So we kind of include the biophysical components of the animals, and then a diet is formulated. And in this way, we know that we can make those assumptions.
The final question from the chat, it says, we have another one in the Q&A. It says, is anaerobic digestion considered within the scenarios or study you carried out? Any thoughts on applying this technology to increase circularity?
Yeah, so no, not yet. Also something on the wish list. The wish list is always very long, but that also has to do with, then we kind of need to also make assumptions on energy demands. And how do we weigh that, like the energy demand versus the food demand? And how are we then, like, how do we assume how much of that energy can come from which sources? So this adds a new layer of complexity, of course, but it is, I fully recognize it's important to go beyond and only food production, and to also assess more all elements of the food system, related elements, because now energy use is more like a fixed amount of emissions that are, if you use energy, then this is what you get in terms of emissions, instead of making that circular in the system again.
So many variables. We have another one. It says, much of the current agriculture systems are based on lowest cost production. Will these alternative diets lead to a higher cost to the consumer?
Yeah, so that's of course that was the point that I referred to earlier. So this is very, very difficult to answer. So we have one PhD student, and we work also with different organizations that would have economic models to get a better understanding of this. As long as you stay quite, as long as we don't change too much within the food system, you can make predictions on prices and costs. But as soon as you really radically redesign the whole thing, it becomes really hard to make those predictions. So then the economic models that the persons with who we collaborate with are actually saying, yeah, we cannot do any prediction that still makes sense, because there are too many uncertainties of what will actually happen if we are so radical in our redesign. So this is something that we now try to understand, like, okay, how far can we actually make those, how far can we go in our redesign to still come to reasonable assumptions, and then we can start linking this. But yeah, of course, that's, and I think that also nicely there was this report this week which came out from the FAO on true pricing. I think this links, of course, to this. If we go to such a system, the cost might go up, but you also have a more environmental friendly system. And then the question is, who will pay for this? Yeah, big questions that needs to be answered, huh?
I have a question here. So I think, we finished with the questions in the chat and the Q&A. I do have a question. So what is your opinion on, or maybe somebody has asked you before, how the modified organisms, let's say plant more productive, genetically modified organisms, could alleviate the problem, like, or could integrate into the model for food production and like soil usage, all this kind of thing?
Yeah, so I cannot answer that now. It's indeed something that I'm interested in exploring. Like, okay, how that's the same as when you transition to, it's of course a completely different question, but it has the same impact on different aspects in the model. Like if you go organic, how is it changing yields? So that's here the same question: how is it changing yields, but also how is it affecting the soil? We just got a very, very big project granted on regenerative agriculture, in which what we aim to do now is to actually also add a very clear soil component to the model, because now we kind of assume, okay, the plants need this, and this, we don't do this because that will probably be better for the soil. But we actually also want to include the mechanisms there much deeper into the model, so we can also better understand this component. But yeah, in terms of if new systems results or new breeding strategies or whatsoever results in new yields, that's something that we can change the yields and then assess, like, okay, how is this then changing all the different aspects in the model? And the same applies not only for the yields, but also for the nutrient composition. So in thinking of new breeding strategies, it's also important to consider the composition of the nutrients in those crops, because if the composition, actually, if they become less nutrient dense, then your yield can go up, but then it doesn't make any sense at the end.
Question here. So in the context of circularity in agriculture, what do you think are the potential policy recommendations that could be drawn from your models in your study?
Yeah, so I think what is important is that, and I know that's not concrete enough, but what you saw in for example, in those 4 scenarios is that it really depends on what we aim for. So for example, if we assume that diets aren't changing, then you have different types of animals when we actually assume that diets are changing. So what we often see with those life cycle assessment studies is that it's a fixed impact per product, but in fact, depending on the scenario, your impact per kilogram of product differs. And therefore, it's really essential to understand, like, okay, what can we expect in terms of dietary changes? Because if no dietary changes are happening, then we need to, for example, then the broilers, it's important to eat more broiler meat and then to replace, and if we eat red meat, to actually have this more from pigs compared to beef cattle. But if we go to this more healthy diet, then you actually see that the broilers are also out of the system, and the pigs are out of the system, and it's mainly dairy and the meat that is related to the dairy system, like the cows and so on. So really, depending on what we envision or where we aim to go towards, that affects also the advices that policymakers want to give to consumers, for example. And I think this complexity, and of course I understand that policymakers need to give advices that are very straightforward, but I do think it's important to understand this complexity, and that one advice is maybe now the advice for with a change in 5 to 10 years, but that if we want to make then a next step in our transition, then that advice might be different again. So I think making people aware of this complexity is important.
And do you have like partners in different countries, like in South America or like North America, where you could like maybe translate your model?
Yeah, so we are now working. We have one PhD student from Ethiopia and one from Uruguay, and actually also a postdoc from Peru and a PhD student from Brazil. But we are now really assessing. We now started assessing using the model in Ethiopia and Uruguay, maybe also in Colombia. That's also like in development. So we have several case countries that we started with. I don't have the answers yet. It's still really in development.
Yeah.
But we did this to actually stress, which was also one of the questions, of course, like what does it mean for each country? It's really, as I said earlier, it's really dependent on where you are in the world. And yeah, we're now zooming into those case countries to get a better understanding of this.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to see the results and like how, yeah, of course, because in South America you produce like way different types of foods in terms of like what kind of vitamins they provide. So yeah, I think it's very, very interesting. I think we are done with the questions, and I would just like to thank you everyone for attending this webinar session, and thank you everyone for your questions. And of course, thank you, Professor Van Zanten, for like accepting our invitation and give us a great overview of your results. We learned like how challenging could it be. It's not black or white. It's like a max, like it's full shades of gray that you can't really like pinpoint like what is the problem, what is the solution. We learned that. And thank you so much for that. And I just finally want to remind everyone that for our 4th breakfast club is going to be on November 23rd. I'll be sending the invitation to everyone in the following days. And in that breakfast club, we're going to have Professor Bruce Osborne talking about uncertainties in the use of land use cover modifications for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and climate change mitigation. And Professor Martin van Itersum is going to be talking about 3 principles of circularity and applications. And I'm really sure you're going to enjoy that as much as we enjoyed this one. Thank you again, everyone. And I'm going to close the session for now and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.